The Whitaker family story has never really been just about one creator or one livestream. It's become a much bigger conversation about trust, accountability, and what happens when internet content collides with the lives of real people. Over the past several weeks, the controversy has continued to grow, and now Eric Carroll is once again finding himself at the center of public debate. Before we get into today's discussion, let me make something clear. This video is an analysis of public statements, public live streams, and publicly available claims that have been made by the people involved. Some matters remain disputed, and some issues are reportedly still being investigated. Everyone deserves fairness, and allegations are not the same as proven facts. Now, with that out of the way, one thing I've noticed lately is that more and more people are reaching out asking the exact same question. Todd, why are you talking about Eric again? The answer is actually pretty simple. Because Eric keeps putting himself back into the conversation. Every time people think the story is slowing down, another live stream happens. Another statement gets made. Another response appears. Another accusation is thrown across YouTube. And every single time that happens, people naturally start asking questions all over again. The interesting part isn't even that people disagree. People disagree every day online. What's interesting is that many of the same questions from months ago still don't have clear answers. That's why this story refuses to disappear. It's not because people enjoy drama. It's because unresolved questions tend to stick around. One of the biggest topics lately has been accountability. Not legal accountability. Public accountability. Those are two very different things. Someone can face criticism without being charged with anything. Likewise, someone can be charged with something while still being presumed innocent until proven otherwise. Those two ideas can exist at the same time. Unfortunately, social media often treats them as though they are identical. They are not. The court of law follows evidence. The court of public opinion follows perception. Sometimes those paths overlap. Sometimes they don't. And that's where this story has become incredibly complicated. As I've continued following the public discussion, I've noticed something else. Almost every conversation eventually circles back to the Whitaker family themselves. That's important because they are the reason any of this became public in the first place. Without them, none of these creators would have crossed paths. Without them, none of these fundraising efforts would have existed. Without them, none of these public disputes would have happened. Yet somehow, they are often the people discussed the least. Instead, the conversation becomes about creators arguing with creators. Screenshots, live stream clips, old Facebook posts, private messages, public responses, reaction videos, counter-reaction videos. Eventually, people lose sight of what actually started all of this. When I look back over the timeline, one thing stands out. Trust. Trust was probably the single most valuable thing anyone involved possessed. Once trust starts disappearing, everything else becomes much harder to believe. That doesn't automatically make anyone guilty of anything. It simply means audiences become more skeptical. And skepticism isn't always a bad thing. Healthy skepticism asks for evidence. Healthy skepticism asks for consistency. Healthy skepticism asks reasonable questions. That's very different from assuming the answer before evidence exists. One of those questions people continue asking concerns money. How much was raised? How much was spent? How much actually benefited the family? Those questions have existed for a long time. They are not new. What has changed is that more people are asking them today than ever before. Why? Because the longer questions remain unanswered, the more attention they attract. Silence is a way of creating its own speculation. That's true in almost every public controversy. Another issue people continue debating involves responsibility. When multiple people participate in the same project, how should responsibility be divided if something later goes wrong? That's rarely a simple answer. Some viewers believe one individual deserves most of the criticism. Others believe responsibility was shared. Still others think the entire situation has been misunderstood from the beginning. Reasonable people can disagree, but disagreement doesn't replace evidence. Throughout all of this, one thing I've tried to remind people is that public statements deserve careful examination. If someone makes a claim publicly, it's reasonable to compare that claim against previous statements. Consistency matters. If a person's explanation changes significantly over time, audiences naturally notice. That doesn't automatically prove deception. Sometimes people remember events differently. Sometimes new information changes understanding. Sometimes people simply explain themselves poorly. But consistency remains important because it's one of the few tools audiences have when evaluating credibility. Another interesting development is how different creators now seem to be telling completely different versions of the same story. One person remembers events one way. Someone else remembers them differently. A third person introduces entirely new information. Suddenly, viewers are left trying to piece together a timeline that no longer matches across channels. That's exactly why documentation matters. Messages, receipts, official records, dates, public filings. Those things tend to carry more weight than opinions. Opinions are valuable. Evidence is stronger. One thing I've also noticed is how emotionally invested many longtime viewers have become. That's understandable. Some people have followed the Whitaker family for years. They've watched birthdays, road trips, simple daily moments. They've seen friendships develop. So when those relationships suddenly collapse publicly, viewers naturally want to understand why. Human beings look for explanations. It's part of our nature. But sometimes there simply isn't one neat answer. Sometimes multiple mistakes happen simultaneously. Sometimes personalities clash. Sometimes communication breaks down. Sometimes money complicates relationships. Sometimes all of those things happen together. That's why this story feels so difficult to untangle. It isn't one issue. It's several issues overlapping each other. Another point worth mentioning involves expectations. People often expect internet creators to behave like journalists. But most creators aren't journalists. They are commentators, entertainers, opinion hosts. That distinction matters because commentary naturally includes personal interpretation. Journalism ideally separates reporting from opinion. YouTube often blends the two together. Viewers then have to decide where reporting ends and interpretation begins. That's not always easy. Which brings us back to Eric. Whether people support him or criticize him, one fact is hard to ignore. He's still a central figure in this discussion. Every new appearance generates reactions. Every live stream creates new conversations. Every statement gets analyzed almost immediately. That level of attention doesn't happen by accident. It happens because audiences still believe unanswered questions remain. Does that mean every criticism is fair? No. Does it mean every defense is correct? Also no. Reality usually exists somewhere between those extremes. And that's why careful analysis matters. Another thing worth remembering is that public attention isn't permanent. Eventually, every controversy fades. The question is what remains afterward. Will people remember lessons learned? Or will they simply remember arguments? Personally, I think the more valuable conversation involves transparency. Whenever public fundraising enters the picture, transparency becomes incredibly important. People naturally want to know where donations went, how decisions were made, who had authority, who approved expenditures. Those aren't hostile questions. They are reasonable ones, especially when donations were made in good faith. Most donors simply want reassurance that their contributions serve the intended purpose. That's not an accusation. That's accountability. As more creators continue discussing this story, audiences should continue doing something equally important. Think critically. Listen carefully. Compare timelines. Separate confirmed facts from personal opinions. Avoid jumping to conclusions before evidence exists. That's not only fair to creators, it's fair to viewers. And most importantly, it's fair to the Whitaker family, whose lives became the center of a story far larger than they likely ever imagined. Because at the end of the day, regardless of who wins an online argument, the question many people still care about most is remarkably simple. Did everything that happened ultimately help the Whitaker family, or did it become something else entirely? That's the question that continues bringing people back. And as new public statements continue appearing, it's a question that isn't going away anytime soon. If you've been following this controversy from the beginning, let me know what you think. One of the things that stands out when you follow this controversy from beginning to end is how quickly the conversation changes depending on who's holding the microphone. One week someone is explaining why certain decisions were made. The next week they are responding to criticism. Then they are responding to someone else's response. Eventually, it becomes difficult to separate the original story from the reaction videos that followed. That's exactly where many viewers say we are today. Instead of talking about solutions, everyone seems to be talking about everyone else. And that's where Eric Carroll has found himself back under the spotlight. Not necessarily because of one single event, but because people have started looking back at the entire timeline instead of focusing on isolated moments. When you do that, patterns become easier to recognize. Now, that doesn't automatically mean those patterns prove wrongdoing. Patterns aren't proof, but they often explain why audiences begin asking tougher questions. One example is how different people involved in the Whitaker story now describe the same events very differently. Depending on whose live stream you watch, you can come away with completely different impressions. One creator says one thing happened. Another creator says the opposite. Someone else introduces information nobody had previously heard. As a viewer, you almost feel like you're watching three different stories unfold at the same time. That's why documentation matters so much. Public records, court filings, official statements. Those things don't have emotions. They don't take sides. They simply exist. Everything else requires interpretation. One criticism that has repeatedly surfaced involves leadership. Whenever someone presents themselves as helping vulnerable families or advocating for others, audiences naturally hold that person to a higher standard. That's true whether someone runs a charity, a non-profit, or simply a large online platform. The expectations become higher because the responsibility becomes greater. People expect consistency. They expect transparency. They expect accountability. And when expectations aren't met, criticism usually follows. That isn't unique to this story. It happens in virtually every public controversy involving trust. Another thing worth discussing is credibility. Credibility isn't built during moments when everything is going well. It's built during difficult moments. How someone responds to criticism often tells audiences as much as the criticism itself. Do they answer questions? Do they clarify misunderstandings? Do they acknowledge mistakes if mistakes were made? Or do they immediately assume every question is an attack? Those reactions matter because they shape public confidence. One interesting observation throughout this entire situation is that both supporters and critics often use exactly the same phrase. Just wait. Supporters say wait because they believe future evidence will vindicate their position. Critics say wait because they believe future evidence will support their concerns. Neither side actually knows the outcome. Both sides are making predictions. That's an important distinction. Predictions are not proof. They're expectations. Until evidence arrives, they're simply opinions about what might happen. Something else that's become increasingly noticeable is how personal many of these disputes have become. Instead of focusing solely on actions, conversations frequently shift toward personalities. Who likes whom? Who stopped talking to whom? Who blocked whom? Who leaked messages? Who appeared on whose live stream? Those details may explain relationships, but they don't necessarily answer the larger questions people originally cared about. Sometimes online conflicts become so focused on interpersonal drama that the original issue almost disappears. That's something viewers should always keep in mind. Another topic that's generated considerable discussion is public perception. Whether fair or unfair, perception has consequences. Even if someone believes they're acting with good intentions, audiences judge what they can actually observe. They judge statements, behavior, consistency, tone, timing. All of those factors influence credibility. Sometimes people underestimate just how closely audiences pay attention, especially in stories that have lasted as long as this one. Longtime viewers remember older live streams. They remember earlier statements. They compare them against newer ones. The internet makes that surprisingly easy. Another interesting aspect is how communities form around creators. Supporters naturally want to defend the people they trust. Critics naturally highlight inconsistencies. Both groups can become deeply invested, sometimes so invested that every new piece of information immediately gets interpreted through an existing belief. That's called confirmation bias. It affects everyone, not just one side. If someone already believes a creator is trustworthy, they are more likely to interpret new information favorably. If someone already distrusts that creator, they may interpret the exact same information negatively. Neither reaction guarantees accuracy. That's why stepping back occasionally is useful. Looking at the broader timeline often provides perspective that individual live streams can't. Speaking of timelines, one thing that continues attracting attention is how much the narrative has evolved. Early discussions focused primarily on helping the Whitaker family. Later discussions shifted toward fundraising. Then came disagreements over management. Then public accusations. Then legal developments involving some individuals. Then additional commentary from multiple creators. Each stage added another layer to an already complicated situation. By now, many casual viewers struggle to keep track of everything that's happened. That's understandable. It's a story with dozens of moving parts. One lesson that can be taken from all of this is the importance of documentation. Whenever large amounts of public attention or public donations become involved, maintaining clear records protects everyone. It protects donors. It protects organizers. It protects beneficiaries. And it reduces confusion later. Transparency often prevents controversies before they begin. Unfortunately, when documentation becomes incomplete or unavailable, questions naturally multiply. Another issue worth mentioning involves expectations placed on audiences. Some creators seem to expect viewers to accept explanations immediately. Others expect viewers to reject competing narratives automatically. Neither expectation is realistic. Audiences have every right to evaluate evidence independently. They have every right to ask questions respectfully. And they have every right to change their opinions if new verified information emerges. Changing your mind after seeing better evidence isn't weakness. It's critical thinking. That's something more people online should probably remember. One reason this controversy continues attracting attention is because it combines several issues people care deeply about. Vulnerable individuals, fundraising, trust, influence, responsibility, privacy. Those topics naturally generate strong emotions. People don't simply watch this story for entertainment. Many genuinely care about what happened. That's why discussions remain active long after many expected them to fade away. As for Eric Carroll specifically, public attention doesn't necessarily mean public conclusions. People can debate decisions. They can analyze statements. They can question consistency. But ultimately, verified facts matter more than speculation. If additional information becomes public, opinions may change again. That's happened before. It could happen again. Stories involving multiple people rarely remain static. New interviews happen. New documents appear. New explanations emerge. Each one has the potential to reshape public understanding. Until then, viewers should remain cautious about accepting any single narrative as complete. Every perspective contains limitations. Every participant has personal experiences influencing their interpretation. That's true across virtually every public dispute. Which brings us back to the Whitaker family. No matter how many creator conflicts develop, it's important not to lose sight of the people whose lives brought everyone's attention here in the first place. Their well-being remains far more important than internet rivalries. Whatever disagreements exist between creators, hopefully future conversations place greater emphasis on outcomes rather than personalities. Because ultimately, that's what many viewers still care about most. Not who won an online argument, not who had the better live stream, not who got the last word, but whether the people everyone claimed to be helping ultimately benefited from everything that happened. That's still the biggest unanswered question. And it's likely the reason this story continues generating discussion months after many expected it to end. As we wrap up this discussion, I think it's important to take a step back and ask a question that's much bigger than any one creator. What has actually changed since this entire controversy began? If you think back to the beginning, the conversation wasn't about YouTube creators fighting with one another. It wasn't about reaction videos. It wasn't about live stream arguments. It wasn't about screenshots, leaked messages, or competing narratives. It was about one family, the Whitaker family. Somewhere along the way, however, the focus shifted. Instead of talking about improving lives, the internet started talking almost exclusively about creators. Who said what? Who lied? Who blocked whom? Who leaked information? Who responded to whom? And every time another live stream goes up, the cycle starts all over again. But here's what I keep coming back to. The family didn't ask to become the center of an internet war. Whether you agree with one creator or another, I think most people would agree that the Whitakers deserve better than becoming a permanent source of online conflict. That's probably why emotions continue running so high. People aren't simply debating YouTube personalities anymore. They're debating whether vulnerable people were truly protected throughout this entire process. That's a much more serious conversation. One thing I believe viewers should continue doing is asking thoughtful questions. Not hostile questions. Not loaded questions. Just reasonable ones. When public fundraising is involved, people naturally ask how funds were handled. When creators disagree publicly, audiences naturally compare timelines. When conflicting stories emerge, viewers naturally want documentation. Those aren't unreasonable expectations. They are part of accountability. Another thing that's become obvious is that this controversy has damaged trust. Not necessarily toward one individual, toward everyone involved. Once trust begins to disappear, rebuilding it becomes incredibly difficult. People begin questioning statements they might have accepted months earlier. They revisit old videos. They compare previous interviews. They search for inconsistencies. That's simply how public controversies evolve. Trust takes years to build. Sometimes it only takes one controversy to damage it. That doesn't mean trust can never be restored. But restoring it usually requires transparency, consistency, and patience. Not arguments. Not insults. Not bigger thumbnails. Actions speak louder than live streams. Something else worth thinking about is the role audiences play in stories like this. Every click sends a message. Every share encourages more content. Every comment tells creators what viewers want to see. If audiences reward conflict more than solutions, creators naturally notice. That's not unique to this story. It's how online platforms work. Controversy often generates engagement. Engagement generates visibility. Visibility creates incentives. The challenge is making sure those incentives don't overshadow the people whose lives are actually being discussed. Because there's a real difference between covering a story and becoming part of it. Another lesson from all of this involves patience. Many people want immediate answers, immediate accountability, immediate conclusions. Real investigations rarely work that way. If official agencies are reviewing information, they're going to move at their own pace. Not YouTube's pace. Not social media's pace. That can be frustrating, but it's also necessary. Serious matters deserve careful examination. Rushing toward conclusions helps no one. Something I've noticed while reading comments is that many viewers have become exhausted. Not because they no longer care, but because they feel like they're hearing the same arguments repeated over and over again. One creator says one thing, another responds. Then someone responds to that response. Eventually, people lose track of what has actually been confirmed. That's why I always encourage separating facts from opinions. Facts deserve confidence. Opinions deserve discussion. Speculation deserves caution. Keeping those categories separate makes conversations much healthier. Now let's talk specifically about Eric Carroll for a moment. Whether someone supports him or criticizes him, it's clear that he's become one of the central figures in this ongoing debate. Supporters argue that he's been unfairly targeted. Critics argue that important questions remain unanswered. Those positions continue to exist side by side. Ultimately, viewers will have to evaluate whatever verified information becomes available and decide for themselves. That's how public analysis should work. Not by demanding blind loyalty. Not by demanding automatic condemnation, but by examining evidence as it becomes available. The same standard should apply to everyone involved. Nobody should receive special treatment simply because people like them. Likewise, nobody should automatically be assumed guilty because they are unpopular. Fairness has to work both ways. Otherwise, it isn't really fairness. One thing that gives me hope is that many viewers genuinely care about the Whitaker family. Even after months of controversy, that's still what motivates a lot of people. They want to know whether the family is safe. They want to know whether they are receiving proper care. They want reassurance that their dignity is being respected. Those are worthwhile concerns. Those concerns existed before any creator disagreements, and they'll still exist long after those disagreements eventually fade away. That's why I think future conversations should focus less on personalities and more on outcomes. How are the Whitakers doing today? Are they receiving appropriate care? Are they safe? Those questions matter far more than who won the latest online argument. Another important point is remembering that online commentary carries real-world consequences. Words matter. Titles matter. Thumbnails matter. The way stories are presented influences how thousands, or sometimes millions, of people understand complicated situations. That's a responsibility every creator should take seriously. Because once information spreads across the internet, correcting misunderstandings becomes much harder. Accuracy isn't always exciting, but it's essential. As this story continues developing, there will probably be more live streams, more statements, more reactions, more opinions. That's almost inevitable. The best thing audiences can do is remain patient, remain skeptical in a healthy way, and continue looking for verified information instead of rushing toward conclusions. That's how informed viewers separate themselves from emotionally driven crowds. At the end of the day, history usually remembers outcomes more than arguments. Years from now, people probably won't remember every live stream. They won't remember every heated exchange. They won't remember every social media post. But they will remember how the Whitaker family's story ended. That's what ultimately matters. Hopefully that ending includes stability. Hopefully it includes dignity. Hopefully it includes privacy. And hopefully it includes lessons learned by everyone involved. Because if there's one takeaway from this entire controversy, it's that vulnerable families deserve protection first and internet attention second. That should never be reversed. As more information becomes available, we'll continue examining it carefully, comparing public statements, separating fact from speculation, and keeping the focus where it belongs, on the people whose lives started this story, not just the personalities covering it. That's the standard I believe every creator should strive for, and it's the standard viewers deserve as well. If you followed this case from the beginning, I'd genuinely like to hear your perspective. What do you think has been the biggest lesson from the Whitaker controversy? Has the public conversation become too focused on creators instead of the family themselves? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments below. If you enjoyed this analysis and want to stay updated as new verified information becomes available, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.